She's from the fashion industry, ladies and gentlemen. Jay-Z.
Jay-Z, yep.
Jay-Z.
Yep, he likes it.
How would you like to start podcast 001 off?
Yeah, this is podcast 001.
001.
I think maybe we should introduce ourselves. What do you think?
Okay, go first.
All right. So, thank you all for listening. My name is Annamarie Fernyak, and I teach mindfulness, and I live a life of everyday mindfulness. And this podcast is about that, living a mindful life. Today, we have two of my team members. Actually, I should say Evan's team members. So I'll introduce Evan first. Evan Ryan, he has assisted me in building the amazing mindfulness app that we're going to talk about. And his associate, Emily, is my social media guru. And she has quite a following in and of herself. So, Evan, why don't you say a few words about yourself?
Hey, I'm Evan. I am an artificial intelligence consultant. I help build software that makes computers smarter, that makes people's lives better. And I am working on the Align Mindfulness Project and working on some stuff with the Annamarie Fernyak brand and bringing mindfulness into each person's everyday life.
Cool. And Emily, how about you?
I am social media, digital marketing, kind of anything that we're putting out on the internet for Align, Annamarie's brand, and focusing now on a lot of partnerships going forward.
So I am going to admit that I'm slightly distracted because I am working to figure out all this podcast technology. And as Emily was speaking, I was being a very bad listener, and I was putting on my timer so that we could time about where we are in the podcast at various moments, and also make sure that we are out of here in our allotted period of time. So, Emily, I'm going to just apologize really quick for being a little bit distracted.
Absolutely. We have a lot going on.
So one of the things that we wanted to talk about today is just we're beginning a new type of team building organizational structure based on some things that Evan is learning. So we had talked about the possibility of reviewing some of the techniques in communication that you offered yesterday. Are you interested in discussing that?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So why don't you say a little bit more about that?
So what's going on here is we have in front of us a 4x4. The 4x4s are just things that we can do as a team to better communicate and better perform with each other. They are so the box is broken up into 4 quadrants. The first is how can we best perform together. The second is how can we achieve the best results together. The third is how can you be a hero to me, or how can this team be a hero to me. And the fourth is what are the things that drive me crazy. And so it's meant to set expectations in a low-risk environment. That way, as we continue to work together, we continue to move faster. Things break, we fix things, we find new challenges and obstacles. We all are on the same page in terms of how best to give feedback, how best to operate with the other person, and the things to keep in mind as we are continuing to develop our relationship together.
So I feel like this is a real high level of learning how to communicate with a group and with a team. And when Evan and I were discussing this, do you call it a grid?
We'll call it a grid.
Grid. When we were discussing the grid yesterday, one of the things that I brought to the table was that in my coaching and in my retreats and workshops that I do, we always do something which is called setting agreements. And it's very similar to what Evan is talking about. I feel that the main difference is that with what Evan's talking about, everybody brings forth whatever, within those 4 quadrants, whatever they need within the group to be able to communicate. The agreements that we offer in coaching and in the workshops and retreats is more about, as a group, defining what those are. So it's two different approaches that get you to the same place. And one of the things that I'd mentioned to Evan is that the one approach to me feels very left brain, very logical, and that's setting things in these 4 quadrants. And the approach that I often use seems to be more right brain, which is more organic, a little bit more tactile, kind of touchy-feely, it speaks a little bit more to the right brain. Do either of you have any thoughts about that?
I'll say when I was putting all of my stuff together, it was really difficult for me. But I also thought it was interesting, like I had to be completely aware of how I do operate and what does drive me crazy and what do I view as like a best performance, because it's easy, like when we were going over his and he was telling me everything, I was like, oh yeah, that's great. But then when you have to actually reevaluate yourself, like it's hard. I was getting 3 or 2 in a few, and then it took me a while. It took me longer than I thought it was going to. For sure.
How about you, Evan? When you first learned about this process, what was your first thoughts and your experience in going through it?
My thoughts were, it made perfect sense to me. Just that's how my brain operates. If it didn't make sense, then we probably wouldn't be talking about it as the person who brought it to the table. But I thought that it was, I like learning in low risk environments. And so if I can avoid a high risk or high stress environment, I like to do so. And so I thought that it was a great way to set expectations for how my team members can think about how I'm thinking and processing information. That way, as things do get more difficult and as there are more balls in the air, we can all work together, but we've started with the same foundation. Mm-hmm. And so we're sort of not moving the goalposts or changing expectations unnecessarily, or because we discovered something new about ourselves and now we have this thing that makes us tick. Mm-hmm. Or our need set changes.
Mm-hmm. And I do think that our needs sets change. And that's one thing I think that Evan and I had talked about briefly, is that if you work in a team, even if your team is your family, if you're working within any kind of a group organization, acknowledging that things are changing as you evolve, and then being willing to be a little bit vulnerable and talk to those other people about what's changing and how they can best work with you. Maybe your expectations for the relationship have changed, or the team have changed, or maybe you recognize that the things that worked for you before aren't working for you anymore. Being willing to go into that team environment and speak. In the woo-woo world, we say speak your truth. So So Evan, how about if you share a little bit about your 4 quadrants and what they say?
Yeah, so for me, starting with how can we best perform together, starting with being alert. So always looking for new areas that could become problems and where we can improve. And this involves understanding what we're working on and how we are achieving our goals from a 10,000-foot view in terms of what could become a problem. I like solving problems before they take place. Secondly, being curious, continually asking questions. I think that discussion and open communication is one of the most important things towards our working relationship, towards probably any relationship. And so if you have questions, I prefer that you ask them up front. That way we can all work through it together, and the outcome of that question might come much faster and might be much more in-depth than had somebody just tried to figure it out on their own. Mm-hmm. Responsiveness, if you have concerns, bring them up. Let's move fast. And so I like to keep that open dialogue. You're not going to hurt my feelings with anything that we're talking about here, but let's continue to have that open line of communication. That way feedback is not necessarily a scheduled time or a scheduled meeting, and instead it's just part of our day-to-day routine. And then being resourceful. I hate reinventing the wheel. I love using what other people have done and customizing it for what we need. People are very smart out in the world, and so let's use what they've put out there on the internet and said, please utilize.
So I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second, because I'm a visual person. So when you're looking at your graph, your chart there, those 4 items you just mentioned are on the top left, correct?
Yes.
And what is the title of that top left bracket?
Best performance.
Best performance. And then each one of those bullet points you just mentioned, what are the titles of each one of those bullet points?
So the first one is alert, which is always looking for new problem areas. Being curious, which is continually asking questions. Responsive, which is if you have concerns, bring them up. And resourceful, which is always see if what you're looking to add has been done before.
Cool.
Let's not reinvent the wheel.
Cool. So then the second section, which is on the right side of
Yes.
that, what is that section called?
It's called best results.
Okay, and what are the 4 quadrants within that?
The first is faster. How can we do things faster? How can we do things easier, cheaper, and then bigger?
Faster, easier, cheaper, and then bigger.
Yes.
And then do those titles of those 4 bullets on each one of those 2 quadrants, do they remain the same for each person, or
Yes.
does each, okay.
They remain the same across the team as the person who is leading the team. Those are the things that I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page about. And then the bottom 2 quadrants, the third being a hero and the fourth being what drives me crazy, those are customizable to you. And so that is what is very unique to you. How you want your team members to be alert changes. How you want your team members to do things faster, easier, or cheaper changes. But just simply doing things faster, easier, and cheaper does not change.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So Emily, do you mind sharing your second quadrant on the right-hand side?
Yeah. So for my faster, I had the earlier I'm aware of an issue, the better. For easier, it's does the team have an end of the month or year goal that we're wanting to hit, and how soon can we recognize this goal so we're able to make like an actionable plan to reach that. Cheaper, this was just constantly finding new ways to produce media for less. So some of our partnerships with like college students and all of that, like how can we utilize those to not be forking out a bunch of marketing money on our end. And then bigger, just finding new ways and new ideas on how we can expand our brand's reach. So a lot of brainstorming on that.
Yeah, and being open to brainstorming. And I don't know if either of you have done those brainstorming sessions with a guided coach, but the one thing that really sticks with me in brainstorming is that no idea is a silly idea, and everything is always connected with a yes and. So always building on the next person's idea.
That's cool.
And it's amazing how you can go from one idea to a fully formed, reasonable plan based on these crazy things that get thrown. Or so thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So from both of your opinions, how do you feel that a graph or this kind of organized communication, how do you feel that can strengthen your team environment?
I know personally after we went over Evan's, I said to him it was great just to like see everything laid out there on paper, because I do feel like I can kind of pick up on stuff from people, but it's nice, like there's no questions, there's nothing's in the gray zone. This is what I need from you, and then it's super easy to move forward from there.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. And I think often feedback changes based off of your mood and what's happened in that day up until that point. And so to have clearly set expectations that are just simply on paper, no matter what your mood is, whatever the rest of your calendar looks like, is the most helpful tool.
One of the things that we use in coaching is just a simple question of, when you see that I'm stuck, what is the best thing for you as a coach to do to get me out of it? So what would be the best thing for me when coaching a client to do to help them get unstuck? And I think that's one way that this chart of communication can assist. And it I don't believe was addressed in there. But what would you say is one way? So say, Evan, you and I are having a conversation and we're just not communicating. We're just not on the same page and you're feeling stuck. What is something that I could do as the person communicating with you to help move the communication forward?
I think rephrase what you think I'm saying in your own words. And so very often we talk out of the different sides of our brain,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll say the same thing to each other but disagree
Mm-hmm.
because we don't understand what the other person is saying.
Agreed.
And so I would say,
Yeah.
here's what I hear you saying.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's either yes or no. At that point, we clarify, we move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yes, good point. Thank you. How about you, Emily? What do you think? Like if you and I were in a conversation and we're just talking and talking, but we're just not
Right.
meeting in the middle anywhere, what would be something that I could do to help move the communication forward?
For some reason, the way my mind works is if somebody comes to me and they give me a list, so say we're just like not connecting, it's like, okay, we need to take 10 minutes or 5 minutes, and here are like my 5 main points I'm trying to get across to you. For some reason, if I'm like reading them and it's just so clear, I can just process that significantly better. And I don't know why that is by any means, but that's kind of been one of the biggest, like in previous jobs and all of that, we would just kind of be like, okay, let's take 10 minutes, write it down what we're trying to say to each other, and then go from there.
That's wonderful because writing goes into a different part of your brain than the listening communication.
Right.
So yeah, that's really good.
That's interesting.
That's good to know also as a person working on your team.
Right.
So for me, if you feel like you're having a conversation with me and you're stuck, like you feel like we're not communicating, we're not on the same page, we're not meeting in the middle, ask me clarifying questions, because I get caught up in my brain, and I'll say the same thing 10 bazillion different ways, thinking that the words I'm using to you aren't getting through. You know? And so then you just get more, at least the other people I have found will get frustrated, and I'll get that blank stare like, you've said this already, you know? If that person would ask me clarifying questions, then I would understand where I'm going wrong. So one of the things I studied when I was getting my certification for coaching was neurolinguistic programming. And it's a way that you speak to the subconscious mind. And one of their precepts is that communication is the response you get. So if you're speaking to somebody and they're not understanding you, you're not speaking their language. So if you really want to have good communication with people, you want to stay aware, and you want to keep your perception open enough that you're willing to change your language so that they understand you. And then that you listen enough that you understand what their language is.
I love that.
So I'm just offering that as a way to move communication forward.
When I was filling out my grid, through the long process that it took, I was sitting there and I was thinking, how amazing would it be if, like, when we enter into relationships, like personal relationships with people, like we could just hand them this grid and be like, here you go. For the next 4 months. It'll change after 4 months, but this is what I need you to do. Nice tool.
Really?
Yeah.
Ask questions is a really simple one.
Yeah.
Asking people how they best communicate, I think, is an important aspect of any kind of a team building exercise, which this definitely is, I would say, a team building exercise. So when your coach offered this grid to you, what was his reasoning, or how does he utilize it, or how did he approach it?
He approached it through a common language. So how it ended up, a common language and mindset, how it ended up being distributed was to the people in the room and to their team members, so that everybody could do it together across the team. And now you have a common way of sort of visualizing and thinking about how each person on your executive team or each person in your relationship is viewing these different aspects. And so as soon as you know that, now you can come at and approach problems from a different frame of mind, and it already lends itself to meeting in the middle, because not only are you taking their approach to it, but they are taking your approach to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've already established now that there's a common frame of thinking, there's a common frame of problem solving, there's a common frame of language that we're going to use as we continue to like solve this problem or attack this roadblock. And it really reduces the number of communication errors that might exist, especially in a high pressure, high stress situation.
Mm-hmm. I also feel in many ways, and maybe you said this, that it opens the door to future conversations about communication. So if you start a relationship with, this is important to me. It's important that we communicate together adequately, that we understand each other's language. Then later on, when you are stymied by the fact that you're not communicating, you can say, hey, it like opens the door to having that conversation without it being aggressive. Mm-hmm. I remember my father-in-law when I was first in my relationship with my husband, he said to me, don't do anything now you don't want to do for the rest of your life. And I've always remembered that. But the flip side of that is do now at the beginning of your relationship what you want to be able to do or what you want to do for the rest of your life in that relationship. And if communication is important to you as a team member, and if you want this team to gel successfully for a long period of time, then opening the relationships with solid communication channels is essential.
Completely agree. And I think in all the relationships that we have, the ones that are the strongest, the ones where you say like, oh, we've been through thick and thin. But if you can just eliminate the thick by being upfront about it, then it was fun the whole time.
It's such a guy response. Really, like, I don't like saying that, but that really was. Hey, let's just eliminate all the issues our relationship might have right now.
It seems totally natural to me.
So I would have to agree with Emily in saying that is living in a dream world to some. I mean, in a perfect world, that would be the way, right? We would always talk out our conflicts as soon as there's any potential or even before the conflict arises. But I know with me, oftentimes I will get angry or I will get frustrated and I won't know why. Mm-hmm. I don't know why. Right. All this stuff is happening in my world. I can't nail it down. Was it this person said? Was it that action that person did? I don't often know. And it can take me a while of thinking about it with a little bit of silence that, it just takes me time to figure it out. And it's part of my process. Mm-hmm. And so I do think people can tend to get frustrated or feel like they're getting the silent treatment. But the reality is, I don't know if they're responsible for what. Right. The fact is I have to go quiet for a while so that I can understand what's happening. And we haven't really introduced much of this yet in this podcast, but I practice and I teach mindfulness. And the practice of mindfulness is this going in a little bit, this period of silence, not so that you calm what's happening, but so that you understand what's happening. So it's really a process of accepting it as it is and then being curious about it. So in the perfect world, I would know that before I get into conflict. But the reality is sometimes I'm in the middle of conflict and it takes me a while before I feel like I can have an effective conversation about it.
I also feel like, too, that's such an important thing for everyone to do, but especially somebody who's in your position where there's so many people that are needing your attention, they're needing your answers. Being able to, know that about yourself. Like, imagine if you didn't practice mindfulness. That would kind of be a hot mess.
Yeah, and it has been at times.
But it's knowing that's why I feel like mindfulness is so powerful, because you are able to know that about yourself and know how you can be more productive for those in your life, in your work environment, and move forward from there. Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, that period of going silent, that period of being curious, that period of wanting to really know what's happening helps me to understand what I call the human condition. So it's not unique to me, right? Mm-hmm. It helps me to understand what everybody experiences. in a way that I can teach it, I can assist others who might be going through it. What do you think, Evan?
Yeah.
He's still like, but this perfect world, but it will happen.
but really, no, really. I mean, what are your thoughts about that?
Honestly, I don't think I could have said it better myself. I don't have anything to expand upon because I think you hit it on the head. Ultimately, that just sort of is how we operate.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we smooth everything, as we continue to understand the people who we are working closest with or are closest to, and as they continue to be slightly more vulnerable and a person with us and not just a shell of somebody who's supposed to create value for 40 hours a week, ultimately, like, the rising tide of that relationship floats all boats, and everybody has a better time, everybody has a better experience, and like, we all grow and develop.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that I think is essential about those rocky periods in any relationship and in any team, if you study relationships in general, there's always that honeymoon phase where, love is blind, so to speak. You're not really seeing those things that are a challenge, could potentially be a challenge. You're just not even seeing them. Mm-hmm. And that's in a team that works as well. So if you have a really vivacious, energetic team that has just been created, you're hot on a topic, you're moving really fast toward a goal, there's that same honeymoon phase. But ultimately, that is going to fade. That honeymoon phase is going to fade. And so building the right communication at the beginning will help you get through the next stages, of which there are many. And also, it takes those rocky points in your relationships to help you build trust, to help you to understand what you can expect out of that person when times get tough. So I don't know that I'd want to eliminate all the challenges. I'm getting some serious contemplation across the table.
You really are. Oh, we're talking about you.
We've got some distraction.
No, I was going to leave it up to Emily. I don't think that you're ever going to eliminate all of it. Like, I don't think a 4x4 grid is going to eliminate all the challenges. But if it eliminates 80% of them, especially the ones that are dumb, that cause a lot of stress in the short term, but it's like a 3-hour-long conflict where this person isn't responding to me, or I read this email as if they were being snippy with me, or I don't like the way that they asked this question or the way that they said goodbye, and then you talk to them 4 hours later and they're like, oh yeah, sorry about that, like, I was distracted. And you're like, oh, now I feel like a total, like, asshole because I was just demonizing this person in my mind for the last 5 hours.
Mm-hmm.
I think if it eliminates those types of challenges, then it saves time, energy, and, like, patience for the ones that are more serious.
So you make a good point, and possibly a point that needs to be made within the grid when something like that occurs. For instance, say you receive an email and you misinterpret it. What's the best way to respond? So that's one of the things that agreements will do. And I'll quickly go through some of the agreements that I have with my team. One of the agreements is take responsibility for your experience. And that means, be responsible for the email that you send, how the other people are going to receive it. Be responsible for whether or not you had a fight with your husband that morning and you bring that into the office. Take responsibility for whoever you're being in this moment and whatever experience then results from that. So if you have a fight with your spouse, you bring it to the office, and then you create angst within the office system. Know that you're kind of responsible for that, right? Because you're bringing in this negative energy. Respect confidentiality. So I think that's something that as a culture we don't do. We don't respect that the conversation that I'm having with Emily and Evan right now, that's going to be held confidentially.
Mm-hmm.
Like, your stories aren't my story to tell. And I think that's something we don't necessarily understand as a culture. Be willing to be guided, which means everybody around us can be our guru in some ways. Everybody has something to teach us if we are willing to be curious about that. Respect the schedule. I have to say, I have not been a responsible agreement person lately in respecting the schedule. But if I'm meeting with somebody, my time is their time for that hour. And if I'm late and I expect them to go 10 minutes over, then that's not fair, because you're not only disrupting your own schedule, but somebody else's. So respecting the schedule is about respecting your own time as well as the other people that you're meeting with. Participate the best you can. What might that mean to you as an observer? Participate the best you can.
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is, oh goodness, like giving it 100% in the areas that you can, because like I'm not an expert on everything and I don't want to be throwing out like inaccurate information.
Mm-hmm.
But if there are areas where I'm like, I think this would be a great thing, then giving my feedback there.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Evan?
I was thinking about my body language.
Mm-hmm.
Like even as you were going through agreements, I got a cramp in my leg, and so I was getting a little bit, like I was fidgeting a little bit, but I didn't.
Which
want you
agreement?
To be
Let's
thrown
go in. Let's dive into this. No.
It was the guru agreement. I got.
Yes.
Yes.
About everybody being your teacher.
Yes.
Potentially. Okay.
The cramp was from something different.
Maybe.
I wasn't stressed about it. It just came up. No, but my real thought was, like as you both are talking, making sure my body language exhibits openness, even if it's something that does not relate to you. Like if what's going on in my world, which is I have a leg cramp, even if that does not relate to you at all, I want to make sure that I'm exhibiting openness, so that you can continue with the thought without getting nervous.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm going to just pause us for a moment. Unfortunately, it's noon, which means we have to sign off. This has been such an amazing conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this has been really fun.
I thought it was fun.
Yeah.
So just so all of you that are listening out there know, we are planning to do this once a week. It may be Emily. I love meeting with Emily and Evan, and the conversations are always so great. So it may be Emily and Evan, or it may be somebody else. But it will always, in some ways, help to reinforce everyday mindfulness and leadership and communication and all those things that help us to evolve to become better people. So thank you for joining me, Emily.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, Evan.
Thank you.
Everybody, have a great day.
Again for joining us today. If you'd like to connect with us on social media, you can find Annamarie at Mindfully Annamarie. You can find myself at Emily VDW, and you can find Evan at _Evan Ryan. We'll talk to you next week.
It is still recording, I think. Well, if it isn't even right now, it's still
Hello,
recording.
people. Hello. We're still here.
That's the soundbite.